Welcome back to another deep dive. We are just so thrilled you could join us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So when I say you, I mean you specifically, the ultimate learner, the person who never just looks at the everyday world and, accepts it at face value.
Exactly. The kind of person who wants to look under the hood.
Right. So today, our mission is to uncover a microscopic, high-stakes battle that is happening right under your nose. In fact, it is happening right in your local produce aisle.
It really is a hidden war. I mean, we walk through the grocery store, we see these perfect, vibrant fruits stacked up under the bright lights, and we have absolutely no idea what kind of gauntlet they had to run to get there.
Oh, totally.
The sheer amount of biological and logistical warfare involved in delivering fresh produce is staggering.
Just picture that fresh, juicy pineapple sitting on your kitchen counter right now. To you, it's just breakfast or maybe the foundation of a great tropical smoothie waiting to
This
happen.
is pretty good right now.
Right. But that pineapple is actually a survivor. It survived a globally perilous journey to make it into your shopping cart entirely intact.
It's a miracle it makes it at all.
It really is. Because today, we are focusing our deep dive on a phenomenon known as pineapple black rot. It's a devastating post-harvest disease that absolutely wreaks havoc on the fresh fruit industry all over the world.
And to truly understand the scale of this threat, we are going to look closely at our source material today. We have a comprehensive breakdown of the pathogen's biology, the rather gruesome physical symptoms it causes, and the extreme measures people have to take to fight it.
Yeah, the almost militant measures that farmers, packers, and global distributors are forced to take simply to stop it from ruining a global supply chain.
It's intense.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to introduce our main suspect. Who or what is actually causing this rot? Let's get into the taxonomy of the culprit.
Right, so our culprit is a highly resilient fungus. Scientifically, it operates under two different names depending on its current life stage.
Which is pretty common for fungi, right?
It is, yeah, a common but really fascinating trait when it is in its teleomorph stage.
Meaning the sexual reproduction phase.
Exactly, the phase that allows for genetic mixing and adaptation.
Yeah.
In that stage, it is known as Ceratocystis paradoxa,
Ceratocystis paradoxa.
but it also has an anamorph stage. This is its asexual phase, where it essentially clones itself to spread rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And in that form, it goes by the name Theolaviopsis paradoxa.
See, fungi often seem to have these grand, cinematic Latin names depending on what kind of biological phase they happen to be in.
They do sound quite formal.
But out on the streets, or rather out in the agricultural fields and the packing houses, the people dealing with this daily have some much less flattering nicknames for it.
Oh, definitely.
It's commonly referred to as butt rot, which is just incredibly descriptive, also base rot and white blister.
Those common names paint a very accurate picture of what this fungus physically does to the plant tissue. But to understand how it operates on a mechanical level, we really have to look at its classification. The data classifies this specific pathogen as a polyphagous wound parasite.
Polyphagous wound parasite. Break that down for us.
It is a highly specific biological description. So, wound parasite tells you exactly what its entry strategy is. It is an opportunistic attacker.
Meaning it waits for an opening.
Precisely. This fungus does not possess the biological tools, like the specific enzymes or physical strength, to just drill through the tough, waxy outer cuticle of a perfectly healthy, intact pineapple.
So it can't just force its way in.
No, it
Yeah.
cannot. Instead, it waits. It requires the fruit to sustain some sort of injury. That could be a cut during the harvesting process, a bruise from being dropped, or even a scratch from another pineapple.
Just any piney breach.
Exactly. The moment the fruit's natural armor is breached, the fungus exploits that opening and gains entry.
So it's essentially a siege tactic. The fungus doesn't have the heavy artillery to breach the fortress walls, so it just sits in the surrounding soil and waits for human harvesting equipment, or maybe a storm, to accidentally cause a structural breach.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. It is entirely dependent on a lapse in the host's physical defenses.
And what about the other word, polyphagous?
Right. The polyphagous part of the phrase means it has a wide and varied diet. It is not an obligate parasite of just one species. While our focus today is on pineapples, this pathogen does not discriminate.
It's a broader threat.
A very dangerous systemic threat to a whole variety of crucial tropical plants. It actively attacks bananas, coconuts, and sugarcane.
It's a generalist threat to the entire tropical agricultural ecosystem. That is terrifying when you think about regions that rely on those specific crops.
He really is.
But looking at the breakdown of this disease, a very specific question comes to mind. Why does this only seem to ruin fresh pineapples?
What do you mean?
Well, you never hear about a massive consumer recall on canned pineapple chunks or pasteurized pineapple juice because of butt rot. It's always the fresh fruit.
That is a crucial distinction, and the answer comes down entirely to the logistics of the global supply chain and the biological clock of the fungus itself.
It's a race against time.
Yes, this fungal infection takes time to develop. It is a biological process of colonization and breakdown that simply does not happen overnight.
Right.
For processed pineapples, the ones destined to be turned into juice or sealed in cans, the timeline from when they are harvested in the field to the time they reach a processing facility is incredibly short, often just a matter of hours or a couple of days.
So the fruit is essentially chopped up, sterilized,
And canned before the fungus even has a chance to unpack its bags and start multiplying.
Wow.
The window of opportunity is simply too tight for the infection to take hold, spread through the tissue, and manifest any rot. But fresh fruit represents a completely different logistical reality.
Because it has to travel.
Exactly. Fresh pineapples have to travel. They are harvested in tropical regions, packed into crates, loaded onto massive cargo ships or long-haul trucks, and sent across the globe to reach a supermarket in London or New York or Tokyo.
And that takes a while.
That transit time, which can take weeks, gives the pathogen exactly what it needs: time to incubate, spread its hyphae through the flesh, and destroy the fruit from the inside out.
Okay, so let's talk about what that destruction actually looks like. If a wounded pineapple gets infected and is sitting in the dark hold of a cargo ship for 2 weeks, what is the visual progression of this disease? What are the symptoms?
It begins subtly at the site of the wound. If that bruised or scratched fruit is kept in unsanitary conditions, particularly with high humidity, which is very common in agricultural shipping, the initial visual cue is the formation of brown and black lesions on the exterior skin.
So you just see dark spots forming?
Right. This indicates that the Ceratocystis paradasa has breached the defenses and is actively killing the surface cells.
But it goes much deeper than surface blemishes.
Much deeper. Over time, those dark lesions transition into soft water rot spots. The internal tissue begins to break down, turning the firm flesh of the fruit into a mushy, unappetizing mess. But the most extreme case, which happens when the infection is left entirely unchecked in a warm, humid environment, is a total structural collapse.
Total collapse.
Yes. The fungus secretes enzymes that aggressively break down the plant's cell walls. It gets so severe that the tough outer skin, the sweet flesh, and even that dense, fibrous central core give up completely. The solid fruit literally dissolves into a puddle of fungal sludge leaking out of the remaining shell.
That is a pure horror movie scenario for a piece of fruit, just melting into a puddle of sludge.
It's pretty gruesome.
And while that dramatic post-harvest destruction during shipping is the most common way this disease impacts the consumer market, infection can absolutely happen out in the fields long before the fruit is ever picked.
It is less common to see full fruit collapse in the field, but it certainly occurs. And when the disease attacks the living plant, the presentation of the symptoms is entirely dependent on the immediate environment.
That's it.
What's fascinating here is that how the exact same pathogen, attacking the exact same species of plant, presents entirely different physical symptoms simply based on environmental humidity and temperature.
Let's break down those environmental disguises. What happens when a pineapple field is dealing with wet weather? Say, a heavy tropical rainstorm rolls through.
In wet weather, you have to imagine the physical dynamics of the field. The wind is blowing heavily, the rain is falling, and those stiff, spiky pineapple leaves are thrashing around, rubbing harshly against each other.
Which causes friction.
Severe friction. It creates mechanical damage. Thousands of tiny micro-wounds across the plant. Because the environment is heavily saturated and humid, the fungus easily enters those fresh wounds. In these wet conditions, the plant responds by developing dark brown lesions directly on the leaves where the infection took hold.
Okay, so wet weather leads to brown lesions. What happens if the region is going through a dry spell?
If the weather is dry, the disease presents a completely different visual signature. The lack of ambient moisture changes how the infected tissue degrades. Instead of wet brown lesions, the plant develops these stark, white, paper-like spots that have very distinct, sharp margins.
What paper-like spots?
Exactly. The dead tissue essentially desiccates. To an untrained eye, it looks like an entirely different disease, perhaps a different fungus or a nutrient deficiency, but it is the exact same pathogen operating under restricted moisture conditions.
And the damage goes far beyond cosmetic spots on the leaves. The toll this takes on the living plant is systemic and severe.
It is.
According to the sources, an infected plant in the field suffers across the board. Its overall growth becomes noticeably stunted. As the base rot sets into the stem and the young developing leaves, the plant starts producing an unusual, distinctly foul odor as the tissue decays.
A very clear sign of advanced rot.
And ultimately, as the vascular system of the plant shuts down under the stress of the parasitic load, it will simply drop its fruit prematurely. It abandons the pineapple before it is even ripe, effectively destroying the harvest.
It is the biological equivalent of jettisoning cargo to save a sinking ship, though usually the plant succumbs to the base rot anyway.
Which raises a critical question about the life cycle of this pathogen. If the plant dies and the fruit rots away into the soil, how does this microscopic menace actually survive to infect the next crop? You would think the fungus would starve to death once its host is gone.
That is where the deep biology of Ceratocystis paradoxa reveals its incredible resilience. To understand its survival, we have to talk about chlamydospores.
Chlamydospores, let's define that for the listener. What role do they play?
Think of chlamydospores as biological escape pods. They are highly specialized, thick-walled conidia, which are asexual spores, produced specifically for long-term survival by the anamorph stage of the pathogen.
So they are built to last.
Exactly. When the host plant dies, or when the environmental conditions become too dry or inhospitable for active growth, the fungus shifts its energy into producing these heavily armored spores. They don't actively feed or grow, they simply drop into the soil, or they linger dormant inside the decaying plant debris left behind in the field, and they wait.
Just lying dormant in the dirt, sometimes for extended periods, waiting for the environment to shift back in their favor.
Precisely. And once the conditions are right again, when the moisture returns, the temperature rises, and they chemically sense the presence of a new, vulnerable host, these spores activate. They germinate and give rise to a new network of mycelium.
Mycelium being the branching vegetative part of a fungus made up of a network of fine white filaments called hyphae.
Yes, the hyphae spread out, consuming available nutrients, which eventually leads to further sporulation. The fungus starts pumping out massive amounts of new spores, leading to a full-blown cascading infection of the new pineapple crop.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the very methods modern agriculture uses to grow pineapples efficiently actually play right into the hands of these dormant chlamydospores. It is a profound structural irony.
It highlights a major vulnerability in how we mass-produce food. Pineapples are largely grown through vegetative propagation.
Right, cloning.
Yes. Rather than planting seeds, which takes a very long time and results in high genetic variability, farmers take physical pieces of plant material, like suckers, slips, or the crowns from the previous growing season's fruit, and plant those directly into the ground to clone the successful crop.
It makes total sense from an efficiency and consistency standpoint. You want to replicate your best yielding plants. But if that specific field suffered from pineapple black rot in the previous season,
then those microscopic chlamydospores are already deeply embedded in that environment. They are hiding in the soil, or even worse, they are physically attached to the very crowns and slips the farmers are gathering. By using vegetative propagation in an infected zone without rigorous sterilization, the farmers are inadvertently hand-delivering the pathogen directly to the next generation of plants. The human demand for agricultural efficiency becomes the exact vehicle the disease uses to perpetuate itself.
we're essentially doing the heavy lifting for the fungus. And because of this interconnected global agricultural system, the reach of this disease is absolutely staggering.
Right.
When you look at the mapping of the infection zones, it's practically a worldwide pandemic for pineapples.
It really is.
The regions affected span across North, Central, and South America, through the Caribbean, across Africa, into Europe, and heavily throughout Asia.
It is a truly global issue, but it hits certain geographical pockets with devastating intensity. Oceania is particularly vulnerable. The disease is heavily entrenched in places like Australia, Fiji, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu.
Looking at that specific list of islands and nations in Oceania, what makes them such a massive target for this specific pathogen?
It all comes down to the environmental baseline. The ideal conditions for cultivating a healthy, sweet pineapple are, tragically, the exact same ideal conditions for the explosive growth of Ceratocystis paradoxa. Both the plant and the pathogen thrive in warm tropical climates with consistently high ambient humidity.
So it's basically a paradise for both.
Exactly. Those island nations provide an endless, year-round incubator for the fungus. Furthermore, there's a highly specific window of vulnerability that occurs during the harvest in these regions.
Walk us through that vulnerability window. How does the harvest process itself trigger an outbreak?
When pineapples are harvested, the crowns are often detached to prepare the fruit for certain types of processing or shipping. Detaching that crown creates a significant fresh wound at the very top of the fruit. If that harvest happens during wet weather, and those freshly wounded fruits or detached crowns are then piled up and stored in large heaps, you create a perfect biological storm.
Because the moisture is trapped inside the heat, the temperature stays warm, the wounds are entirely exposed, and the spores in the environment go into absolute overdrive.
Exactly. The disease quietly takes hold right then and there, inside the heap. The insidious part is that the infection might remain somewhat latent. You might not see the severe rot immediately, but the pathogen is established. It becomes a delayed action time bomb that detonates either during international transit or when those contaminated crowns are planted the following season.
And the economic devastation of that time bomb going off is hard to overstate. We aren't just talking about a supermarket throwing away a few bad fruits. To ground this in economic reality, research shows that in India alone, pineapple black rot is responsible for a massive 10% annual yield loss.
10% of an entire nation's yield is a catastrophic loss of revenue and food supply. And we
Right.
have to consider the compounding nature of that specific statistic.
Yeah.
When a farmer loses a crop to base rot, they don't just lose the fruit they were going to sell that year. Because of vegetative propagation, they also lose the healthy planting material, the seed capital essentially, that they desperately needed to start the future growing seasons. It is a multi-generational economic hit that can bankrupt small-scale farming operations.
The threat is so severe that certain regions are actively utilizing international law to protect themselves. French Guiana, for example, has officially classified Ceratocystis paradoxa as a quarantine pathogen.
That is a highly significant legal and agricultural designation. A quarantine pathogen classification means a government recognizes the organism as an existential threat to their regional agricultural industry. It triggers strict border controls, mandatory inspections of incoming organic material, and the legal authority to seize and destroy entire shipments if even a trace of the fungus is detected. They're building a legal wall to keep the biology out.
Which highlights the absolute necessity of aggressive intervention across the entire supply chain. So what does this all mean? How do the farmers and global distributors fight back against a microscopic enemy that is this resilient?
It requires a meticulously calculated, multi-layered defense strategy that begins the moment the fruit is severed from the plant. The very first line of defense is post-harvest triage, which often involves a highly specific thermal treatment.
The hot water bath defense. I want to dig into this because it sounds incredibly counterintuitive. How hot does the water have to be, and how does it not ruin the fresh fruit?
If there is suspicion that a harvest might be infected or exposed to the spores, workers will submerge the pineapples in a hot water bath that must be maintained at a minimum of 50 degrees Celsius.
Wait, 50 degrees Celsius is incredibly hot. That's halfway to boiling. Doesn't essentially cooking the outside of the pineapple damage the tissue and make it spoil faster?
It is a very delicate balancing act. The 50-degree mark is explicitly chosen because it represents the thermal death point, or at least the severe suppression point, for the surface-level fungus and active spores. The tough outer rind of the pineapple can withstand that specific temperature for a brief, calculated duration without suffering permanent cellular damage, while the more fragile fungal structures cannot. The thermal shock minimizes the post-harvest symptoms and stops the pathogen from advancing rapidly into the deeper tissue.
So they use a calculated thermal shock to buy time, but hot water alone isn't going to protect a piece of fruit sitting on a cargo ship for 3 weeks. What is the next layer of defense?
For long-term storage and international transit, the industry relies on highly targeted chemical applications combined with strict environmental suppression. The fruit is treated with specific chemical agents, primarily triazole fungicides. Chemicals like triadimenol or propiconazole are applied to create a protective barrier that actively disrupts the cellular function of the fungus.
And if the chemical barrier isn't enough, they manipulate the climate inside the shipping containers to physically pause the biology of the pathogen.
They drop the ambient temperature of the shipping containers to exactly 9 degrees Celsius. This number is not arbitrary. 9 degrees is the specific threshold that actively limits the sporulation of the conidia without causing what we call chilling injury to the tropical fruit. If it gets too cold, the pineapple's internal structure degrades. If it gets too warm, the fungus wakes up. At precisely 9 degrees, the fungicide attacks the existing mycelium, while the cold aggressively prevents the fungus from reproducing and spreading its spores.
It is a highly coordinated biological lockdown, and the logistics required to maintain that lockdown are intense. The hygiene protocols during the packing and transportation phases have to be flawless. If one infected fruit with a tiny scratch touches a healthy fruit and the temperature fluctuates even a little bit, cross-contamination could compromise an entire shipping container.
Absolutely. The post-harvest work is vital, but the true foundation of managing this disease begins out in the dirt. Farmers must proactively alter their land management strategies. They have to actively invest in improving soil drainage across their fields. Because the fungus thrives on excess moisture and high humidity, the most effective baseline defense is to engineer the soil to stay as dry and well-drained as possible, starving the dormant spores of the water they need to activate.
And it requires changing operational habits as well. There is a fundamental rule in managing this pathogen. Actively avoid planting or harvesting during wet weather. If a farmer knows the wind and rain are going to cause those micro wounds on the leaves and they know the moisture will wake up the chlamydospores in the soil, they simply have to halt operations and wait for a sunny, dry window to move their crops.
It requires a level of patience, forecasting, and environmental awareness that is fundamental to modern agriculture. Every single decision, from the day the slip is planted in the dirt to the exact temperature of the refrigerated shipping container crossing the Atlantic, must be precisely calculated against the known biology of the pathogen.
It really puts the sheer scale of human effort into perspective. Which brings us all the way back to you listening right now. The next time you're standing in the produce section of your local grocery store and you reach out to pick up a fresh, heavy, spiky pineapple, take a moment. Just take one moment to appreciate the absolute gauntlet that specific piece of fruit had to survive. It survived the constant threat of a polyphagous wound parasite. It was submerged in a 50 degrees Celsius thermal shock bath, coated in targeted triazole fungicides, and transported across oceans in a meticulous 9-degree climate-controlled lockdown, all just to make it into your shopping cart intact.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a stark reminder of how incredibly fragile our global agricultural supply chains really are. We have grown accustomed to our supermarkets being fully stocked with tropical luxuries year-round, but behind the scenes, humanity is locked in a constant high-stakes war with microscopic organisms that are relentlessly evolving to consume our food supply before we do.
It is a silent war, fought with temperature dials and soil drainage, and the stakes are massive. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to mull over based on the biology we explored today. We established early on that this fungus, Ceratocystis paradoxa, is a polyphagous threat. It doesn't just infect pineapples. It actively attacks bananas, it attacks coconuts, and it attacks sugarcane. Think about the tropical regions and island nations where those specific crops are not just casual food items, but the absolute foundational pillars of their entire economy. If a region's entire agricultural livelihood relies on a monoculture of those specific staples, could a single, highly severe cross-species outbreak of this fungus theoretically trigger a cascading quarantine that shuts down a country's entire agricultural export industry overnight?
When you analyze the biology of the pathogen, its ability to survive dormantly in the soil, and the precedent of regions like French Guiana utilizing strict quarantine classifications, that hypothetical scenario of total agricultural lockdown suddenly does not seem so far-fetched. The deep interconnectedness of these tropical crops makes whole regions uniquely vulnerable to a single, adaptable microscopic enemy.
It is definitely something to think about the next time you enjoy a tropical fruit salad. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away looking at the produce aisle and the world at large a little differently today. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop exploring the hidden complexities of your everyday world. Catch you next time.